Why is there no Chag Hageula for any of the 22 liberations of the Tzemach Tzedek?
First of all, the story very briefly. The Haskalah, the reform, which started in Western Europe and in Germany, had tried very, very much to make inroads into the Jewish communities all over the world. And they showed some success in a lot of places. Their greatest resistance was where Chassidus was, because the Chassidish Rebbe, the Chassidish Tzaddikim, the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, and also the Alter Rebbe, smelled a rat, as it were. They saw straight through them. They couldn't fool them. And there are Rishimis from the previous Rebbe where he tells stories about Shimon HaKofer and others who had tried to deceive the Alter Rebbe, and they couldn't fool him. It's Yadua that the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who was a Chassid and a Gaon, sent his Talmidim to Berlin because they managed to convince him that their interest was only Chochmah and not to steal God and faith from the Jewish people. But the Chassidim and the Chassidish Rebbes, they couldn't fool. So in Eastern Europe, where Chassidus was, the reform had no inroads. But they tried very hard. And they worked very hard. And there was a lot of cruelty about it. In other words, they were on a mission. And if we were going to stand in their way, they would do whatever necessary to get us to be reformed, even if they had to use unsavory methods, mean and evil and hurtful techniques. And one of the many things that they did was that they involved the government of Russia. And their pretense, their front, was education. Jews have been educating their children for thousands of years. The whole phenomena of public education is a relatively modern idea. And but the Jews need to be taught how to educate their children. They don't know, they need to be reformed, to be modernized. And they put enormous pressure on the Jewish community to create modern schools, reformed schools, with new ideas and new techniques and new methods. And of course, at the base of it was giving primacy to intellectualism and scholarship and even skepticism at the expense of faith and spirit. And the whole Yiddishkeit, we exist not because we're smart, even though Jewish people are known as people of the book. We exist because of our faith. And there was a lot of pushing and pulling on for a very, very long time. And it culminated in a famous meeting that took place in 1843, Tov Reish Gimel, in Petersburg, where they invited 5 people, one to represent the Chassidim, the Tzemach Tzedek, one to represent the Misnagdim, the Elamishah, Rabbi Itchel of Volozhne, the son of the great Reb Chaim Volozhne, one to represent the business community, whose name was Halperin, and one to represent the Haskalah, and his name was Betzalel Shteren. And the 5th person was the government agent, who was an anti-Semite, and he always sided with the reform. The Tzemach Tzedek went to Petersburg and spent 3 months there, and he was under an enormous amount of stress. He had his children, and many people say Tillim all the time. The Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbetzin, Chaya Mushka, who was obviously very close to him, was a Tzaddiket. She was the daughter of the Mittel Rebbe. Whenever the Tzemach Tzedek had difficulties, he would go into his wife and he would say, Zog van mir a por kapitlach Tillim. Please say some Tillim for me. He used to say, Ich halt von ihr Tillim. I think very highly of his wife's Tillim, his Rebbetz's Tillim. Sie is the emes abas Talmud Chacham. She is the true daughter of a Talmud Chacham. He went to that meeting and took tachrichim. He took shrouds. In other words, the message was that if need be, he's not going to come back alive. And of course, there's the famous story that the Tzemach Tzedek was asked, how could you be so reckless with your life? You have Chassidim. And the Tzemach Tzedek gave 2 answers to that question. One of the answers was, I'm leaving them my sons. And the other answer is the Achdus of Chassidim, the Avis Yisrael, zwischen Chassidim, wird sie halten bis Mashiach. The unity, the love amongst Chassidim is going to keep them till Mashiach comes. So it was very, very stressful, very, very intense, very stressful, and very serious. He was in Petersburg for 3 months. He was hosted by the government, so they provided him with room and board and whatever accommodations he needed. It was outwardly very dignified and respectful. But under the surface, it was very sinister. And Tzemach Tzedek wouldn't give an inch. There was no negotiating. He was absolutely adamant that nothing should be touched. Nobody has the right to tell Jews how to educate children. We're the inventors of education. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and nobody can teach us how to do it and teach us what it means and what it's for. And he fought tooth and nail. One of the interesting silver linings of this cloud was that this Betzalel Stedin, who was a modern man, he was a reformer, he was what you would call today a secular man. He was a very fine man. He was not. There was a fellow named Lilienthal who was involved in this whole mess, who was also a reformer, but he was a corrupt man. He was a sick man, and he got into all kinds of trouble. And the way the Reshima ends, the Kuntris at Tzemach Tzedek, the last paragraph said this: Lilienthal got into all kinds of trouble. He had to run away from Russia. He moved to Cincinnati and he started the reform in America. That's the story. That's the last paragraph of this book called Tzemach Tzedek et Nuas HaSkola, is this Lilienthal. But Betzalel Stedin was a very decent man. And on a personal level, him and the Tzemach Tzedek saw eye to eye. There was a lot of mutual respect. And there were occasions during these 3 months when the Tzemach Tzedek would press a nerve and Betzalel Stedin would vote with him. There's a story that the question of Kabbalah came up. And they wanted to outlaw Kabbalah. And you have to remember, there was two who would always vote the same way. Tzemach Tzedek and the Ish Lozhin always voted the same. The reformer and the government person always voted the same. The business person, Halpern, usually abstained. And if it was 2 against 2 and an abstention, the government always would tip the scale. When the question was about outlawing Kabbalah, so the story is told that the Tzemach Tzedek was staying in a government building. The meetings were held at another government building, and between the 2 buildings there was a private park that belonged to the government. Tzemach Tzedek had a pass to go into this park because he was an invitee of the government, but he never did. He always walked around it. One day when they had this argument in the morning about Kabbalah, he said to his entourage, we're going to walk through the park. And they walked up to Betzalel Stedin, this Mr. Stern. He was sitting on a bench, deeply in thought. And the Tzemach Tzedek walked up to him. And you must understand that they were diametrically opposite. They were at war. But somehow there was a personal respect. And the Tzemach Tzedek quotes the Gemara. Bocha Rabbi v'yomar yesh keine elome b'shoa achas. Stimmet uns. The Gemara says about Rabbi HaKadosh that he cried how a person who could sin his whole life and could do tshuva in one moment. So the expression is, you can purchase the whole Eilam Haba in a moment. So Tzemach Tzedek said to this Betzalel Stedin, you can purchase Eilam Haba in one moment. Vote with us on the issue of Kabbalah, on that one issue. And he did. In any case, so this is the story. And the Tzemach Tzedek was so reckless. He was meeting with the highest levels of government, which meant that there was a certain decorum, there was a certain order, there was a certain kind of respect. And there was an enormous amount of pressure put on him, and he wouldn't bend at all. He wouldn't compromise anything. So frequently he would express himself in a way that could have been construed as disrespect, and they'd lock him up. It was called house arrest. But house arrest was not a game. It was a serious thing. They deprived him of access to mobility and maybe to people who were with him. And of course the connotation was behave or else. It could get worse. So it says in Ayem Yem that during the period of his arrest, this happened 22 times. 22 times he experienced this kind of house arrest. So the question is why we don't make a Chag Hageula out of it. And I can think of many reasons. Of course, the obvious answer to the question is, you died of a visa. I have no idea. The second obvious answer is because the Tzemach Tzedek did not declare a Moyed. Tzemach Tzedek did not make a Yom Tov out of it. You remember, Yutas Kislev is a Yom Tov that Alter Rebbe is released from prison, which the Alter Rebbe himself declared. Yud Kislev is a Yom Tov that celebrates the Mittel Rebbe is released from prison, that the Mittel Rebbe himself declared. Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz is a Yom Tov that celebrates the previous Rebbe's release from prison, which he himself declared. Hey Tevis, Chamisha Tevis is a Yom Tov that's due with the redemption of the Sfarim, which the Rebbe himself declared. Those are the Yom Tovim that we have. Tzemach Tzedek did not make it into a Yom Tov. So that's the obvious reason why. But the question is why not? And I can think of a number of answers. One of them is that there wasn't the spiritual side to it that the other events had. In other words, we know what the Rabbeim say, that when the Alter Rebbe was taken to jail, It wasn't a struggle with the misnagdim that he was dealing with. It was happening lamailo. There was a kitrug against Chassidus. Chassidus was being judged, and his redemption was a psak, was a verdict from heaven that Chassidus is legitimate and has a right to exist and so forth. Conceivably, at that time, what Tzemach Tzedek was dealing with in Russia was not based on a kitrug lamaila, that there was some kind of a obstacle against Chassidus which had to be broken through. So if there's no spiritual side to it, the Tzemach Tzedek did not make a yom of it. As you can see in our history, the Alter Rebbe was released from prison twice. He didn't make a Chag Hageula out of the second time he was released. Because the first time it was happening lamaila, and that's the celebration. So the first answer is that that this did not happen lamaila, klayachol, it happened only lamata. So Tzemach Tzedek did not make a yom tov out of it. Another reason that I can think of is because it was never gula shleim, it never finished. Tzemach Tzedek going out of that house arrest is not the point. That the government of Russia should stop mixing into Jewish education, that's the point. And that never ended. It went on and on and on and on. I mean, eventually what ended up happening is the reformers made schools, and they were forced attendance. They made certain children attend. I think even some of the Tzemach Tzedek's own grandchildren were forced to attend these schools as part of whatever the government decided at that time. They superimposed education and Jewish children against the wishes of Jewish people on the Tzemach Tzedek. So you're not going to make a goal if the no didan natzach, you didn't win. And there may be one other reason why. And that is that we know that the Tzemach Tzedek was very wary of any pretentiousness, of any showiness, of any lama tisro in the Lashon HaPasuk. You see, the Mittel Rebbe's Chassidus was grand. It was gorgeous, it was beautiful. This is such a bad word in the language of Chassidim, but I'm going to say it because it's the correct word. The culture of Chabad peaked by the Mittel Rebbe. He had on staff a choir and an orchestra. On staff, he paid people full-time to compose music, both musicians and chazonim who would compose and sing nigunim, some of which we know, like Haneres Halalu and Pada B'Sholem and the Mittel Rebbe's Kapelli, etc. And there was something very grand about it. The Mittel Rebbe had a stable of horses, and there were Chassidim who did maneuvers. These were all part of what you would call Chassidic culture. In addition, there were all kinds of traditions, like the Yechidus Tanz and the Niggin called Baruch Hu Elokeinu that they would sing. When the Mittel Rebbe was arrested and liberated, even his geula was not really such a geula shleima. The issue was that the government saw the power of Lubavitch. And they began to meddle. And the pretense was that they felt that the Rabbi were not managing the tzedakah funds that were being given properly. And they started to mix in. And the Mittel Rebbe felt very intruded upon, he was not happy about it at all. When the Tzemach Tzedek became Rebbe, he deliberately stopped a lot of these traditions to take away the external grandeur of Chassidus, simply to diminish what there was to look at. There was a distinct effort to quiet Chassidus. They stopped the Yechidus Tanz, they stopped many things. And it's conceivable, it's possible, that the Tzemach Tzedek felt that he would not make a Chag Hageula. And again, I'm more inclined to believe that there was no Chag Hageula because it was not a Geula Shleima. The story didn't end. It still hasn't finished. But perhaps also this factor, he didn't want to do anything to be showy and pretentious. So he was mavater on this inyan. But these are different thoughts, that's all they are, is thoughts. And I don't know what the truth is. Right? I would say Haboicha Yivchar, but we don't choose right and wrong by vote. It has to be emes.